I have today declared that the coronavirus presents a public health emergency in the United States.
Newly released videos from the body cameras worn by two former Minneapolis officers are shedding new light into the death that set off protests around the world.
This is what happened when the talking stopped, when the far-right Proud Boys squared off against Antifa and other counter-protesters.
For many Americans, 2020 has been a year like no other, marked by a worldwide pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement, and an overall tense political climate. Americans from all walks of life are facing unprecedented challenges. But for transgender Americans, these events have collided with ongoing struggles including higher rates of physical and mental health inequities, economic insecurity, and a national epidemic of anti-transgender violence, especially for people of color. Several community-run organizations have been working tirelessly for years to provide direct services and support to the transgender community. I was fortunate to have been paired up with Gender Health Center Sacramento, a trans and person of color-led 501c3 that provides programs, trainings, and direct services that center queer and transgender people of color. Initial plans with the organization included working together to create a digital storytelling project which would reflect the lived experiences of trans folks, recognizing that harm to trans folks' mental health is the symptom of a toxic culture of white supremacy, cis heteronormativity, and capitalism, and acknowledging that these stories have been erased by the dominant culture for centuries. During the summer, it became clear that the storytelling project as planned was not going to be possible. The sudden onset and uncertain course of COVID-19, the uprising against anti-Black racism, and the simultaneous decision by the Gender Health Center to restructure their organization deserved and required immediate attention and resources. After several meetings, the Gender Health Center and I decided to put this project on hold.
This is a really challenging time, unprecedented to people who've been in the field for decades. We've got a situation right now, of course, we're dealing with the immediate effects and the nonprofits who are still providing direct services to people who demand is spiking, doubling, tripling. So you've got the challenge of meeting the demand on one hand. You've got organizations that are they're reeling from the financial effects already.
I realized that even as a trans person, I was not fully aware of the struggles that community-led nonprofits face on a day-to-day basis. Even in good years, nonprofits face considerable financial difficulties. The addition of COVID and federal and local cuts to funding have only made funding more precarious, with many nonprofits already experiencing steep declines in total revenue and projecting declines over the next year. A recent report from the Nancy Bell Evans Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy estimated the average decline in total revenue experienced across nonprofits this year is approximately 30%. With regard to health and human service nonprofits, this decline is paired with significant changes in service demands, an average increase of 28%. Not to mention that within nonprofit funding, for every $100 awarded by U.S. foundations, only 28 cents specifically supports LGBTQ issues. Even before COVID, before folks were taking to the streets to fight for their lives, and before an additional slurry of hate-fueled legislation was put forth, the trans community was dealing with disproportionate rates of systemic and interpersonal violence. According to a Williams Institute 2019 report on LGBT poverty in the United States, transgender people have especially high rates of poverty, with 29.4% of transgender people living below the poverty line. A 2017 poll by Civic Science and the National LGBTQ Task Force found that the unemployment rate for trans and gender non-binary workers was 16%, 2 to 3 times the national rate. The National Center for Transgender Equality reported that 1 in 5 transgender adults had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. According to the Human Rights Campaign Foundation's Anti-Trans Violence Report, by November 2019, at least 25 transgender or gender nonconforming people were fatally shot or killed by other violent means. The events of 2020 have only exacerbated these inequities. COVID-19 has magnified deeply embedded physical and mental health disparities in the trans community. According to the Centers for Disease Control, older adults and people who have severe underlying medical conditions like obesity, diabetes, or heart or lung disease are at higher risk for developing more serious complications when they have COVID-19. A brief put out in April 2020 by Jody Herman and Catherine O'Neill detailed transgender adults' vulnerabilities to COVID-19 in the U.S. They reported that as of 2016, 217,000 adults who identify as transgender were 65 or older, and 361,400 transgender adults reported being in fair or poor health. As of 2016, nearly 320,000 transgender adults reported having one or more of the following underlying health conditions. Over 200,000 have asthma, 81,000 have diabetes, 73,000 have heart disease, and 75,000 are living with HIV. For many transgender people, dealing with medical situations and doctors can be triggering and inaccessible. Jody Herman and Catherine O'Neill also found that 137,000 transgender adults did not currently have health insurance, and 450,000 trans adults hadn't gone to the doctor in the last year because they couldn't afford it. Among those who could access medical care, nearly 500,000 transgender adults felt concerned that if they expressed their gender identity, they could be denied good medical care. COVID-19 and the social distancing and stay-at-home orders associated with it have also been linked to mental health challenges. The CDC identifies financial strain, job loss, and social isolation as factors associated with elevated risk for suicide, all which have been exacerbated by the pandemic. The Human Rights Campaign and PSB research found that LGBTQ Americans were more likely to become unemployed as a result of the coronavirus epidemic than their non-LGBTQ counterparts. Their report, released in May, found that 17% of LGBTQ people had lost their jobs because of COVID-19, compared to 13% of the general population. LGBTQ people of color were disproportionately affected, with 22% of them reporting losing their job because of the pandemic, compared to 14% of white LGBTQ people surveyed. Based on data from the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality, nearly 600,000 transgender adults have attempted suicide in their lifetime. In addition, it is estimated that 300,000 transgender adults live alone, which may increase isolation and disconnection from family or other networks which may provide special assistance related to healthcare and daily living. For those sheltering in place with family members, home may not always be a safe place. Many transgender people, especially trans youth, experience conflict or rejection from their families due to their gender identity. According to the U.S. Transgender Survey, 800,000 transgender people would say that their relationship with their parents is strained or conflicted, and 755,000 transgender adults have experienced intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 2020 has also been marked by a significant increase in violence against trans people, especially trans women of color. Described by the Human Rights Campaign as the most violent year against trans people they've ever recorded, the number of transgender or gender nonconforming people who were fatally shot or killed by other violent means hit 40 in November, nearly double the number who had been killed by this time the previous year, with Black and brown trans folks accounting for almost all of the deaths. Gaining momentum and national attention, activists marching as part of the Black Lives Matter movement since the murder of George Floyd have also called for attention to the violence against Black and brown trans folks. Trans folks of color have been targets of police violence during many of these protests. In June, a non-binary activist of color passing out snacks and other aid was injured in Sacramento when police began shooting rubber bullets into a crowd. They were hit in the face 3 times, once with a tear gas canister and twice with rubber bullets, sustaining a fractured skull and requiring multiple surgeries.
It was like a war scene, you know? I turn around and then I just fall to the ground.
T was struck 8 times.
7 rubber bullets and a tear canister to my head. Why would they aim for my head? You know, like are they trying to put me out? You know, are they like looking after people? Are they protecting and serving? You know, like I don't understand.
Trans folks of color have been fighting this abuse for years, dating back as early as the 1960s when Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick of protest at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, sparking the beginning of the gay rights movement. Though they have also historically been underrepresented, even within the LGBTQ community, where advocacy organizations have usually been led by white cisgender people. Black trans activists are calling for the redistribution of resources within mainstream LGBTQ organizations. Raquel Willis, a prominent Black trans advocate, was quoted in the New York Times saying, "National nonprofits with strong funding need to get serious about reallocating resources to Black and Brown-led grassroots initiatives, and they need to really reorient themselves around who they consider to be a leader." While the official storytelling project remains on hold, my learning and growing as a person and as a scholar continues. This experience has forced me to reflect on the way rigid academic research agendas do not always fit easily or at all into the structures of these community organizations, and that oftentimes it requires all of the resources of the organization and individuals involved to provide the critical, ongoing support that is so desperately needed in our community. It has made me keenly aware that in order to be successful, public scholarship must truly be a collaborative process and one where the research truly grows out of the needs of the community, and that what communities need changes, and sometimes quickly and in a way that no one could have predicted. I am committed now, more than ever, to use my platform as an academic and researcher to work with nonprofits, leaders, and other members in my community to interrogate and tear down the oppressive systems and culture that harms trans people every day, especially trans women of color. In closing, it must also be reiterated that funding to community-run organizations, especially those run by and centering LGBTQ folks of color, can literally become a life or death matter. According to funders for LGBTQ issues, the top 10 funders of Black LGBTQ communities accounted for 65% of all support for 2017 and 2018. Funding from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation accounted for 5% of total funding of Black LGBTQ communities through its support of community organizations. In addition, through programs like the UC Davis Mellon Public Scholars Program, the Foundation continues to fund trans scholars like myself to help these organizations do research, highlight inequities, and demand policy changes and justice.